Greetings. My name is G.S. Raju. I'm on faculty at the University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center. Today, I have the special privilege of interviewing my mentor, my role model, and Dr. George Triadafilopoulos from the University of from Stanford University. And I had the privilege of starting my career in journalism when George was the editor-in-chief of GI Endoscopy. George, you did a lot of great work, and we want to hear from you so that it helps the younger generation how to develop their professional careers as well as their academic careers. So, George, you grew up in Greece and then came over to the United States, and you had a great career here. So let's start from your roots.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you personally again and on camera for your kind invitation. And also to emphasize the point that the mentor-mentee relationship is always bi-directional. So if you think you've learned from me, believe me, I have probably learned twice as much from you. And I have been blessed by our interaction professionally and personally over the years. And it's been a great journey, as you know. We both have lived it. And our mission as academic physicians is and will remain to somehow excite, inspire, advise to a degree possible the younger people. And you and I, you here in Houston, myself at Stanford, we're interacting constantly with the fellows who have their own anxieties, their own dreams, and we have been very active, and both at the level of the journal, GIE, video GIE, but also at the level at the hospital, making rounds, educational lectures, and so forth and so on. So to take myself back to my beginnings, as you asked me for, yes, I was born in the south of Greece, the only child of two parents who had basically survived World War II and the aftermath and basically the restructuring or reconstruction of Greece after the ruins. They were both civil servants, not physicians, on a very limited budget, but I was coming from what would be considered a good family, if you will, of professionals in the past, as well as a good reputation for being good people in the community. And in my early days, I was very much supported by family around, as an only child, but with relatives all around. And I was told that you have to excel, you have to be better than us. My parents were not able, because the war hit them at the time that they were supposed to go to college, and they didn't really make it there because my father fought the Germans for 4 years, and my mother was hiding away from the Germans as a young lady. And so they wanted me to excel in whatever I wanted to do. Interestingly enough, I wanted to be a priest at the beginning of my life, in my 7th or 8th year of life, which is not very different than a physician in many ways. I mean, we care for people, we attend to people's needs. Mm-hmm. We're always thinking about their inner world as well as the outer world. So that was my early influence. As a teenager, my first hit, if you will, was that my mother became ill with a standard urinary tract infection, but as you know, it creates chills and fever and pain because she had nephrolithiasis and so forth. So the physician at the time came to the house, mm-hmm. This was back then, mm-hmm. and attended to her, and it was an amazing experience for me as a kid that I saw this dramatic improvement overnight of my mother after the physician visited her. So I started exploring the concept that's an interesting thing. That's a good thing. You can help people. My mother felt better. As a single child, mother is beyond God. So mother got better, and I started actually interacting with her personal physician, who had actually been trained in Canada, in Montreal, and had returned to Greece. And he actually started giving me his books, a book of physiology, a book of biology in English. And I started browsing through them, and I started kind of turning myself in the direction of medicine. In the Greek system, medicine, you go after high school immediately into medical school. So you have to get through an examination that is very difficult. And after you pass that examination, you qualify to enter medical school. And there's a huge preparation between 14 and 17 years of age to prepare on physics and chemistry and languages and biology and so forth and so on. So I basically focused my activity in doing that in an effort to get into medical school, because I had decided that I will follow the example of my mother's primary physician. And I accomplished that with an exam at the age of 17 after very hard work, and I entered the university. And basically you have a course of 6 years of, as you know, preclinical and clinical activities, and then you graduate. So soon after the medical school experience and really the opening of the world of medicine, initially at the basic science level and subsequently in the clinical side, I also started to see the relative limitations of advancing in research in the environment of Greece, which is a small country with small potential. Plenty of brain potential, but not as many resources. And so I started exploring a possibility of going abroad to explore that future, particularly with aim of research. And I first tried rotations in France, because I was a French speaker as well as an English speaker, so I was able to do rotations in French hospitals and then subsequently UK hospitals. So I would spend all my summers, May to September, instead of vacationing the Greek islands as one would imagine I would do. I would go around in different hospitals and doing rotations and exposing myself to how other practices are. Again, it was not research at the time, it was more clinical stuff, but it was part of the curriculum, and it was part of my activity to get to the point that I would prepare myself for some decision about postgraduate education. I finished first in my medical school, and I was basically blessed to immediately enter into a training program, but at that time in Greece, the training program that I entered was in pulmonary medicine. So I started a year of pulmonary medicine, which is, and at the time was broader than that, because the technology was not as advanced. But during that year, I prepared myself to come to the United States. The reason for the United States was that I felt that the opportunities are far more than where they were in France or in England. And so I thought it would be a better opportunity for me. A bigger country, bigger opportunities, much more advanced research, I thought at the time, which I think is still true today. So I started actually learning how to type on an old typewriter in which I prepared my application for all the programs in internal medicine in the United States. At that time, there were 110. And the same repetitive application. Click, 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 click. And that was it. So I basically learned how to type. Back then we had no iPhones, no computers, none of that stuff. So all the applications were sent by mail. And as a classic FMG, despite the fact that you have recommendation letters and you're first in your class and this and that, you get rejected. And you get rejected and rejected and rejected. Some people don't even bother to respond to you, which I understand. And I managed to get an interview from Wayne State University in Detroit. And they asked me to interview by phone, because before you can come to the States, you have to have visas and things like that. So back then, you couldn't.
Right.
And you couldn't afford it either. So I interviewed over the phone with, I thought, someone who was a faculty member, but it turned out to be the chief resident at the time, who eventually became my chief resident. And at the time of the interview, he was asking me all kinds of questions. I mean, the differential diagnosis of hyponatremia, how do you manage hypothyroidism? And I found it amazing. I said, wow, this is going to be exciting, because if I answer all these things and I go there, I will learn twice or 10 times that much. So I passed that interview. The next I knew that I had an invitation and a visa to come to the States.
So this was when?
This is 1980 in Detroit, Michigan, in the middle of the crisis. That crisis, we have many crises thereafter, but that crisis, in which gas was a problem, electricity was a problem, all kinds of issues. So I arrived in Detroit, Michigan, which was not the greatest place to visit as your first take of the United States. And Wayne State is in the downtown area. And my first day actually was at the county hospital of Detroit, which it opened actually its doors that week. So I was the first series of interns to work at this new hospital. Be it as it may, I started my internship at Wayne State, which was a phenomenal time, because the emergency room was packed with all kinds of disasters coming in. I mean, from the door to the OR was 3 minutes, just wounds and bullets and drugs and this and that. And I was just in heaven. I mean, I would see medicine at its best. And I learned a tremendous amount during that year. I mean, it was a remarkable time, because all of the things that I had studied and I had seen to a degree or another became so much alive during that year. It was just a phenomenal experience. And during the internship and the subsequent residency at that institution, I was putting temporary pacemakers, starting a jugular was just, 10 a day, 15 a day or something like it. It was just a 5-minute deal. And the sigmoidoscopies, I was reading echocardiograms of the time, the M-mode echocardiograms. And so it was a phenomenal experience, that all hands-on, not very much supervision. You were your own doc, your own show. I mean, there was some attending here and there, but it was just do your job right and you will learn on the job. And the next time, teach another person, teach another person. So after all this exciting experience of 3 years of internal medicine, I started saying to myself, I should do a subspecialty training, because that's the place to do the research. At that time, general internal medicine research was not very well developed as it is today, or at least I was not exposed to it. So I ended up, actually, while I was a resident, working in the lab of Dr. David Bull at the time, who was a gastroenterologist who had trained at the Brigham, actually the BI. And he was doing some research on lymphocyte trafficking and immunology, so I worked in his lab while I was a resident. Whatever time I had off, I would go down to the lab, play around, come back, do whatever. So based on that, I then interviewed in many places for fellowship in gastroenterology. I was interviewed at Pittsburgh, at Stanford, and other places. And I chose Boston University because, first of all, I clicked with Tom Lamont, who you know, and he was an inspiring figure, at least in my life. And he had a beautiful group of both clinical as well as basic scientific faculty members. And so it combined both my dream worlds of continuing a good clinical experience with basic science. So we went to Boston. By that time I was married with 2 kids, not to emphasize this thing, but you know, I'm also a father at the same time. But you know, I go there, and again, the exposure to gastroenterology at the time, which is now 1983, and the limited amount of endoscopic experience, because in order to do an endoscopy or a colonoscopy would be a big deal. Barium studies were the way to do it, and so forth. And my attendings were not endoscopists, so I was a generation somehow halfway. And most of the time I had to learn on my own. Back then, as you remember, or you may not remember, it was something that you look through the hole of the scope, the fiber optic. There was no videos. So I started getting involved in endoscopy. I loved it. And then I was also lucky to find a person who at the time was part of the faculty, but not full-time faculty. He was in private practice in the Boston area, Bill Vanneman. And Bill actually at the time had a Volvo, and in the back of his Volvo he would have the case of the duodenoscope. So I would join Bill in his Volvo, and we will go all around Boston, 128, and all the little hospitals, and do ERCPs. He was one of the 3 or 4 people, Bob Shapiro at the time, and a few others in Boston, and Bill Vanneman was with me going around on my spare time. So at the beginning of the day, I would start an experiment in the lab with working on the understanding of C. difficile colitis and this and that. Then as the experiment was running, I would jump into the car, join Bill, do an ERCP, which is what? Watch Bill do an ERCP. But then I would go back to my own place, and because nobody else would do ERCP, hey, here I am. So my boss says, George, you like ERCP? And here you go, do ERCP. Back then, no anesthesia, just Valium and Demerol, an angle of view this big of the scope. You had to find the ampulla for hours and hours, cannulate with limited gadgets and technology. Anyhow, so that led to ERCP. I finished my training, and then Tom says to me, you know, I would like to keep you as a faculty. Oh, great, fantastic, thank you very much. So I started continuing my work with Tom on the basic science side of things, and then at the same time that I'm hired, another faculty member leaves and says, oh, I'm going to New York. So Tom comes to me and says, you know, you have experience in motility, don't you? I said, yes. Okay, because at the time I was a fellow of a famous gastroenterologist named Philip Kramer, and so I had learned from him whatever esophageal motility we used at the time. So I become automatically the person responsible for ERCP and for motility at Boston Medical Center, covering Boston University Hospital, Boston City Hospital. So that was my life for a few years. So then the opportunity comes for California. I was asked to look at a job at the VA hospital in Martinez at the time, which was part of UC Davis. So I fly to California, and all of a sudden I find myself in Greece. I mean, it was just sunny skies, and temperature, and women in bikinis, and surfing, and this and that. And I said, oh, Boston is too cold for me. I'll take my chances in California. But the real reason for California was that I was actually, at the age of 30, given the opportunity to be chief of a GI section, program director. I had the lab that was, I don't even know how many square feet lab, and I also had a postdoc working for me. All of that was as part of the package of going there. And the most exciting part was that I had basically 2 fellows a year that I would train for 2 years at that time. So I became all of a sudden fully responsible adult with a lot of administrative responsibilities, research responsibilities to grow my career, and at the same time a lot of clinical work in the VA, which involved on the average about 20 endoscopies a day, endoscopies, colonoscopies, and ERCPs. So that really immersed me into the clinical activity, to the responsibility of training young people. To this day, they remember that they were in tears because I was so tough with them. I was told that my rules were that they had to, before they graduate, they had to have 1 or 2 papers, peer-reviewed papers. Otherwise, I wouldn't sign their certificate. I told them that, although it was not legal. I found out later, but I told them that. I scared them and they worked hard. Every one of them published 2 papers at the time. And I also wanted them to do a journal club every week that was a basic science journal club, unrelated to whatever clinical stuff they were doing. So I wanted it basically to have them read and critically assess some kind of a basic science paper reflecting gastroenterology. And my favorite journal at the time, and still is Journal of Clinical Investigation, because it has a lot of translational stuff, at least back in the day, less so now. So the fellows that I basically produced during those early years, there were about 3 or 4 years at Martinez, they were very, very happy with the experience, and I was very thrilled with that experience. And then the Loma Pietra earthquake hit California. The hospital was deemed unfit to operate, so I made a lateral move to the VA Palo Alto, which was 50 miles away, and that was part of Stanford University. So I became basically a faculty at Stanford in 1992. By that time, I was an associate professor at Stanford, based at the VA Palo Alto, and working with another remarkable man, Harry Greenberg, who is a gastroenterologist but a virologist as a profession. And he had a big lab, and he said, George, if you want to use my lab, go ahead. Because when I left Martinez, I didn't have my own lab, and so he says, no, use mine, do whatever you need to do. And at the same time, I had another major figure in my career, Bisher Omari, who is now professor of physiology at the University of Michigan, who was working next to Harry's lab, another basic research activity in molecular biology and cell biology. And again, he volunteered to help me in any way I could, he could, and in any way I wanted. So I said, okay, guys, that's a good deal. I'll work in the endoscopy unit most of the time. You will be relieved of your clinical responsibilities because I know you need to be in the lab. I'll do my part to cover you up. You cover me up here whenever it's necessary. So it was a very nice, practical, down-to-earth arrangement in which all sides, helped each other. So when Harry needed something for his virology, immunology experiments, he needed tissues. We had IRBs. We had tissues that I would get in the endoscopy unit. Then I started my own activity with looking at behavior of tissue in response to acid and bile and so forth and so on to understand Barrett's and reflux. I would go to the lab and ask them, what do you think about this idea? Oh, this is good. This is not going to work. This may work this way and so forth and so on. And I was able to do basically a combined clinical activity in the endoscopy unit. Most patients would be part of a clinical protocol that would allow me to study them in one way or another. Ultimately I had about 35 IRB protocols going at the same time. So every patient who would come to see me could potentially fit into something. And that actually related me to the patients much better because they actually wanted to participate and to help out the research. And then I go to the lab, and the lab was supported by mostly Bisher, and then I brought other people in. Rebecca Fitzgerald, who you know, she's now at Cambridge. She comes in and says to me, my husband is here as a visiting professor at Stanford. Do you mind if I work in your lab? And I said, no, my lab is doing these things. Oh, she says, I want to work on colon polyps. And I said, sorry, but that's not what we do, but if you want, you can do this. So I introduced her to Bisher and to myself, and we started working together. She's now one of the most noticeable and impressive gastroenterologists with the field of esophageal research in Barrett's and so forth. And that's, emphasized again the relationship between mentor and mentee. So we worked for a few years with Rebecca and others. Peter Searson, I came to the lab, worked for a year and a half. And then a lot of other people, Roy Setikno, who you know very well. He was my first fellow when I moved to Stanford. I started on July 1st, and Roy was starting July 1st. Shai Friedland, Tanya Kaltenbach, generations of fellows thereafter that inspired me, and I learned a lot from them, and I think they learned from me. We had a lot of activity. Lauren Gershon is another one of the fellows that I trained. So the basic principle, operating principle, was that we'll think more and more about the issue. We'll try to create projects that will reflect the inadequacies of current medical knowledge, how to improve that knowledge for the subsequent generation. So, and pretty much the same process repeated with many, many other people. And it was a great experience in terms of the sequence of fellows up to today.
So let me ask you this thing. You had a fantastic career, and then you wanted to devote a lot of your time to journalism, and you took over from Mike Sivak. I think that was the time that we all had that farewell dinner from Mike. That's when I came and shook hands with you. You didn't know me from Adam, but I said, George, I need to say hello to you. And as an editor, you did a fantastic job. I think you changed from a paper version to electronic submission, and under your leadership, the journal hit the sound barrier, I should say, 6, impact factor 6.
Yeah.
And you had the wisdom of having several international editors on your panel, with Steve as your right hand, Steve Edmundovich, current president. So let's talk about that thing, and that was the time when you actually shifted from the V8 to practice.
Right. So the interesting story there. Jacques Van Damme, who was a faculty member at Stanford at the time and director of endoscopy, and now he's at USC, was involved in ASG and the governing board at the time. And so he comes back from a meeting and says they're looking for a new editor of gastrointestinal endoscopy. Would you be interested? I really had not given it a thought. But I did think about it because, he and I had interacted, and of course I was based at the VA at the time, and then Jacques was based at Stanford. We interacted a lot during conferences and meetings and so forth. And up to that point, although I was a member of ASG for my entire career since I started actually my fellowship, I became a member actually of the society as a resident, believe it or not, before even I became a fellow. So I was reading the journal, and I was following that, but I was more involved in basic scientific research, not as much endoscopic, which I eventually did. But so I said, let me give it some thought. So I put some thoughts together, and I prepared a presentation, and I went to Chicago, where the ASG offices were, and I interviewed with a team of people who were basically going to decide about who we're going to select as a new editor. And I presented a concept of what I would like to do, some kind of a summary. And the key elements there were modernization, the transition to a digital medium, utilization of video, and also international involvement. Up to that point, as you said, none of those elements had been pursued. So they liked that. They liked this dramatic change. It was black and white. So, and the final thing, which was the coup de grace, if you will, was that I changed the name. It used to be gastrointestinal endoscopy. Now everybody says GIE. And all of that activity in the back of my mind, as I remember now, it was at my office, and Roy Satikno's office was next to mine. He would come in, we would test the possibility of how the look of the journal is going to be and how the letters will go and so forth and so on. And he was the one, and you, of course, eventually, to basically lead the video piece, because I was not really the guy to go for videos. I mean, you guys were playing with videos all the time. I would do my cases, walk out, do the next case. But Roy would take videos. I mean, even to this day, he does this, videos. So, but it was an important mission, which we cultivated then. We also cultivated the digital submission, the digital release, the publication, and so forth. But then the other big decision that I had sensed that it was needed at the time was to engage international people who are representing all 5 continents, if possible. And I tried to do as much of a representation as I could. So when I selected the group of associate editors, including yourself, I based my selection on regional elements, that is, somebody's in Germany or in the Netherlands or Japan, as well as elements that pertain to their own expertise. So you were the go-to man for education and for videos and for other things as well, you know, all the other things that you did. But you were overlapping to a degree with Roy, who was mainly in the same kind of area. So there were 2 associate editors on overlapping issues, and the same thing in different domains. For example, I never really learned EUS, so I didn't really know very much about EUS, hands-on type of knowledge. And so I had EUS person, and I had ERCP person. I had, you know, people overlapping their activities. So I could actually have a representation of the field of gastrointestinal endoscopy in its entirety, as well as representation of the field of endoscopy in the world over. And that was an important component. And I opened the journal to submissions from international groups with an openness and a handshake, and please share with us your knowledge, your experience. And I invited them to contribute to the journal. I engaged them. We all did. You were involved in all of that, as you know that. In reviewing papers, in getting to network with everybody else, creating opportunities for young people all over the world to learn how to do proper endoscopic research, how to publish, how to expect, what to expect when the publication is ready to go, and so forth and so on. So all of that, I thought it was part of our mission as a group. I actually didn't do anything. You guys did the work. I was just basically a conductor in an orchestra that was highly sophisticated. It was the Berlin Philharmonic in terms of who was who in the world of endoscopy at the time. They were all with me on GIE, and I was just sitting there basically playing a little bit the strings here and there. So it was all your job, and I think we did a phenomenal job doing this, the journal. Now, the interesting part, to go back about the journal, at the time that I was asked to be the editor of the journal, I was also told that I cannot do 2 jobs, which was a standard at the time. You could be a professor at Stanford, or you can be a chief of medicine at some place and be a journal editor. But my bosses at the time did not allow me to do that. So I actually left the VA. Stanford could not accommodate me at the time because they didn't have the resources. So I ended up staying on an academic faculty at Stanford, but I actually started my own private practice. Basically, I didn't want to leave the area, and I just said I will just start private practice, which I did, and I still do. And in the practice setting, I immediately put forth mechanisms in place to continue doing clinical research. the beauty of private practice, if you want to do research, is that you can actually do it very quickly because you don't have, I mean, you can decide to buy a piece of equipment, for example, and you just write the check and you buy the equipment. You don't have to go through 5 committees to get approval, and delays and delays and delays. And I organize my practice in a way that I have standardized questionnaires and strategies of how to manage this and this and that. So since that time, I have been able to do a fair amount of research, clinical research work, mostly cohort studies, some retrospective, some prospective. But I have remained active in the field of clinical research, including endoscopic research. And now back at Stanford for the past several years as a faculty with a more of a defined academic mission, which is to be the executive director of the Stanford esophageal program, which we have a special program that's multidisciplinary in nature, involving surgeons, gastroenterologists, motologists, endoscopists, ENT, all of us working together in addressing people with esophageal complaints. And this was a project that I started about 2 years now, and we have a very, very active clinical as well as research productivity. So it's been a very beautiful journey, very active journey that kept us really going and kept us excited.
I think looking back, one of the things I actually gave it to my son is your vision statement that you wrote.
Oh wow!
And what your vision was. He was interested in journalism. I said, this is a beautifully written piece, and I still remember the pages, talking about different concepts that you outlined. And I also look back and say, you also had this very special, warm relationship with the group, with Steve, your senior associate editor, Steve Edmundovich. And at that time, there was a transition. Debra Bellman came as the managing editor. It was a lot of fun to work with all of them.
It was actually a blessing again, because when you get to take these major positions, I mean, being an editor of an international journal is not an easy thing. You have to basically satisfy primarily your audience, which is your readers, but at the same time, a lot of other factors play in. For example, the journal, as you know, is part of the ASGE, so you have a governing board that is basically overlooking what you're doing, making sure that you're doing the right things, you have not caught up in a scandal or some sort or whatever. You have to really field out a lot of problems. And so I said to myself, I need someone who is going to be senior enough and I can really have confidence that if something happens to me, can run the journal. And I chose Steve, who now, as you know, is the president of Society, to take that role, kind of almost president, vice president kind of ticket. Because, who knows what happens, and, health issues, et cetera, et cetera. So Steve was really a very important piece, a very important element and player in this. And then I was actually lucky that Debra came a year into the, I was a year editor by that time, that the then assisting editorial manager person left, and so Debra came and picked up an ever-increasing role. I mean, she became the journal, basically, for all of us, and you included. So, I mean, without Debra Bellman, I think we would not be any place. So the dedication, the endless hours that she put in, her style, which was very, very collegial, very soft, very easygoing, those were, remarkable traits that she offered to all of us, and all of us really were blessed by. So that has been a great thing. And the leadership of the Society overall at least during my tenure and thereafter, I think has been very, very supportive. They actually incorporated our visions, mine and then eventually yours, to their overall activity. So I think that they're opening their minds slowly and steadily.
I think for the sake of the audience, the video GIE, the roots started when you became the editor-in-chief, because you were the first one to start the video section.
Correct.
Right?
But without
The
you and
ability
Roy,
to-
I would not have done
Right.
absolutely
Right, yeah.
anything. So
Right.
let's make sure that
Right.
the audience understands this.
No,
It's
no.
all your baby and Roy's baby.
Thank you.
All I did is basically, I thought, you guys are right. We should have done this years ago. And I didn't even know that that technology existed. And then you did this great course that you had every year. And you trained generations of people. And I think that has been phenomenal. I wish we could do it internationally to a degree or another.
One of the things that I really admire you is your ability to come back from major setbacks. I came and visited you right after that major incident. You want to talk about how you actually came out of that? It's very interesting. Right now I'm in the middle of reading this, listening to this book on David Goggin. There's a book called You Can't Hurt Me. It's fascinating how people can come out of adversity. And every day I think, and I said, wow, I shouldn't be complaining.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously a difficult task. I was, as you know, a very active runner, jogger, cyclist, sailor, and a traveler. I mean, I would go all over the world, as you know, and I would pick up a plane, fly to Sydney, and come back the next day for something. So, and that all came to a halt when I suffered this bleeding in my spine that put me on a wheelchair, and it was a major shock. Obviously, the immediate thing is, do I survive or not? It happened in Vietnam, of all places, far away in the middle of the Mekong River on a riverboat. I was taken to hospitals, then flown back to Stanford by plane, and so forth and so on. And then you came and visited me at the rehabilitation phase. But what happens at the time that this happens and you're hit by this reality, and you know because you're a physician, in some ways we're privileged because we know what's going to happen to us, and we do know that. So you start to put things together and you say, what am I going to do? I cannot do any of those fun things in my life. But I immediately said, but you love reading, you love music, you love writing, and you love to take care of patients. And my immediate concern was, am I going to be able to practice again? And how am I going to be seen by my patients when they see me on a wheelchair? And all these questions obviously were very, very important early on, but they eventually settled on their own because my practice is thriving, my research is thriving, I'm still alive, and I can still do endoscopy, which was actually the most important thing. And I do a full panel of cases, including ERCP, therapeutic endoscopy. I take call for the emergency room. So all of that came back with its inherent difficulties, of course, time, mobility issues, and all that. But it really did not stop me, because I think the simple answer is because I love what I do. And if you have it in you and you like what you do, you will do it under whatever circumstances. And I see it as a blessing in the sense that I can have, whatever years I have left, something to look forward to do something useful to myself, to my family, to my peers, to my junior members or fellows, continue in some ways to give them some. And the message, the unwritten message is, if this guy does what he does on a wheelchair with all these difficulties, probably you can do it as well. And as long as you try, you will succeed. So it's an effort issue and a dedication issue to something that you believe deep in your heart that you really were called for. And so I don't know what I would be if I didn't like medicine and gastroenterology specifically as much as I do, and I didn't like patient care as much as I do. Because truly, in my world, we see all these worried well, we call them, and they come into the office and they're 28 and they're just full of life, full of health, full of energy, and they're just panicked because they think that something is wrong with them because they read it on Dr. Google. And I have to somehow sit down with them and say, look, you know, you're going to be fine. And sometimes they don't even believe me. And they're looking at me in a wheelchair and they're so much healthier, but at the same time, it's not about me, it's about them. So, but it's kind of a subliminal message in the background that here's a person who really cares about you and he will do the best you can. He has survived all this adversity. He's there to hold you by your hand and take you through the difficult steps, and you will be fine. And I think in that respect, it also has helped my patients who appreciate my participation in their medical issues and their lives. And I think I have helped people since the event, which is now 7 years. An interesting vignette is that I was in the hospital, bored out of my brains, because sometimes you're stuck in bed with this condition, and I actually had my computer on, and I finalized a manuscript that I wanted to finalize a long time ago, but I did it in the hospital, and I submitted electronically to the journal a particular paper, and went through the review process while I was in the hospital, and was accepted while I was in the hospital. And the paper appeared in press. And as you know, at the bottom says review or whatever, submitted on this date, reviewed, and then accepted on this date. So these dates, if you actually match those dates to what I was doing, I was an inpatient in the hospital at some point early on, kind of close to death. But I was recovering from that, and I had nothing to do other than looking at the ceiling and using my computer. So I usually show that to my fellows and says, you know, you can do this out of the hospital bed. Anybody can do whatever. So as long as they want. If they want it enough, they will be able to do it. So vouloir et pouvoir, they say in French, which is whatever, it's translated in English, wish and you will accomplish, or whatever.
So let me ask you this thing. I think for the sake of the audience, my fellows had a great time meeting with you yesterday, and they were all talking about it, and the sage advice you gave them. So for the sake of audience, if somebody is starting their GI fellowship now, and what are the 5 things you would tell them? You keep doing this, you'll have a great career.
Okay, so the first thing I would tell them is that if they can manage to maintain some degree of engagement in the scientific question, some degree of wonder about how is that working, or why is this not working, or why we're not as good with this disease, or why we're better with that, and so forth and so on. And they keep some kind of a spirit of constant exploration. This is the best way to fight boredom. And boredom exists in gastroenterology because you cannot do 15, 20 procedures without any other thought. You have to do something that will continuously inspire you to do something with all this routine activity that you do, which is relatively repetitive. And in these days, actually, it's even more repetitive because people do only this part. At least in my era, we were doing everything, right? So even if we had forgotten how to manage this, we had to look it up and catch up, and then
Right.
catch up, and then the next thing you know is you go something else. So it's
Right.
kind of the ball was all over the place.
Right.
Now you have one ball, IBD,
Right.
or one ball, the esophagus, and it's relatively easy.
Right.
So the first thing is wonder, continue to explore. The second thing would be because that will actually help you with your overall career, your 30, 40 years that you will put in. You will always have something exciting happening.
Right.
The second thing is to believe in yourself, to believe that you can do whatever you want to do, and the concept that you can do it better from what it existed or whatever you received at the time that you entered, because obviously the knowledge advances, things are changing, and that way you will continuously keep yourself and inspire yourself to keep at it and have this positivity that you can accomplish something. And part of that is patience. Patience, because things do not happen overnight. Many of us think that, oh, okay, we have pulmonary edema, we'll give some Lasix, the pulmonary edema goes away, everything is great. But in our world, in gastroenterology, it may take some time before something happens. And this is more true in research, because you start out with a concept saying acid is bad for your esophagus, but you have to prove it multiple times and from different angles, and it eventually becomes clear that yes, this is a true statement. So if you start a research career in whatever you choose to study, be prepared that it's going to take time, it's going to take a lot of perseverance, it's going to take a lot of rejection. I remember 1996, 1997, Rebecca Fitzgerald and I came up with a concept that acid may affect Barrett's esophagus in a negative way and may lead to cancer. And then we did some subsequent work showing that the better acid suppression, the less the chance for cancer to develop. And I was attacked right and left by the authorities at the time, saying, oh, why are you promoting this? You don't know for sure, you don't have the trial and so forth. I said, I understand. It's a concept, but we need to work on it. So a group in England started working on it. They did a randomized control trial of high-dose PPI and aspirin. And they found that you can actually affect, in a positive way, mortality from esophageal adenocarcinoma. This happened 3 months ago. So all this time, it's 20 years, I have been promoting a concept with my own uncertainties, but I was promoting a concept that the authorities, if you will, or the experts would say, oh, it's too premature, you have to wait. So don't lose your hopes, don't lose your patience, and try to do something that will change things. So when you finish this journey, you can look back and say, well, I made this little change in the textbook of medicine, just this little change, and I contributed to some degree for this change. And I think that would be enough for most of us. I think that would be a great accomplishment. The third piece is to remember that they have families and they have obligations at home. And I'm blessed that my 2 children still talk to me. And actually my 3 grandchildren now are in the Houston area, and I'm visiting them today. And they actually are thankful for the fact that I was excited in my own pursuits, because I was a kind of a liberal father and open-minded, and they would do whatever they wanted to do. I never really pushed them to become physicians or anything like that. Although my son has attended enough lectures with me, speaking and him in the background, that he has an opinion about certain conditions, such as acid reflux or C. difficile. But don't forget the family. Don't forget your own offsprings, and don't really overdo it in one direction or another. And we, as gastroenterologists in particular, are called upon. You were called upon last night. We're called frequently in the middle of the night. We can be away for a while because of whatever clinical activities we have. So it's a balance that needs to be maintained. And finally, I guess the last thing to advise is to don't take things for granted. I see that today with a little dismay. In other words, and yesterday we had this conversation with your fellows. The guidelines say that. The guidelines say that. My fellows do the same. The guidelines say that. No. Yes, I understand. Listen to the guidelines, but take it a step beyond and say, how were these guidelines made? Mm-hmm. Because most of the time it's expert opinion, and expert opinion is an opinion. Mm-hmm. So it's important for particularly the young people who start out to look at the evidence mm-hmm. behind every one of these statements or the guidelines, which, as you know, are American guidelines, and British guidelines, and Asian guidelines, and European guidelines. It's just everything in a big chaos. And nobody tries to dig into and take all the initial research that exists, and the original research that exists, and say, okay, how do we best answer this question? How do we move from guidelines of today to the guidelines of tomorrow? Mm-hmm. So you can contribute something of your own experience. So don't take it for granted, just do something in terms of the research. And in my opinion also, the best thing to do today in the current environment, particularly as it pertains to endoscopic research, we need to have consortia or groups of people with common interests. And I actually had this conversation with your junior faculty members yesterday. You find 5 or 10 colleagues at your level, plus minus few years, who have gone through the same training and they're doing the same things at their own institutions, get together and say, okay, what are the issues that we face today in advanced endoscopy? Is POEM good or bad? Is G-POEM good or bad? Is EMR better than ESD? Is this or that or that or that? And try to come up with a proper way to study these questions in a multi-center, prospective, ideally even randomized effort to do comparative effectiveness of different techniques and demonstrate indeed that this is the technique to stay in Barrett's ablation or in colonic resection or whatever. And the only way to do that would be to work together with others. And that actually gives you an additional advantage, which is that the agencies that fund the research are more likely to fund such a concerted effort than to fund you and me individually. Because they know that the numbers that they will be generated at the end of the day and the multiplicity of involvement by different people who perform endoscopy at different levels will be important for the world to know. So I think that would be the best advice that I can think of now to tell a young person starting out an academic career is not to create their own silos, and it's me, myself, and I, but to just try to reach out to 5 or 10 people who are in the same boat, create these questions, and then start with, let's say, 5 or 10 multi-center prospective trials. And each one of these people takes the lead role, but contributes to the other stuff. It's, my interest is ablation, your interest is resection, but we have 2 studies, both in resection and ablation, but if they're randomized and controlled and prospective, you can contribute patients, I can contribute patients, and so forth and so on. And that way we will advance knowledge much faster and in an organized way and in a scientifically robust and correct way.
Thank you so much, George. When I look back, my first connection with you was your article in Gastroenterology on C. diff, the varied manifestations.
Wow.
Wow. I was in Delhi doing my gastroenterology fellowship, and then at that time, whenever we read the article, we also memorized the name. And I could not pronounce your name, but I said, okay, George T. So that actually still, you said, like, in that article, I still remember that how C. diff was thought to be like a surgical emergency because some of them presented with like a bowel obstruction features with the beautiful X-ray findings. You know, that's how I got impressed with your name, and then later on.
At least I know there is one person who read that article.
Yeah. And later on, I had the good fortune of working with you, and you are a great mentor, a great friend, and a great role model. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.